Is spiritual enlightenment a members-only club? The suspicion that Gnosticism, with its emphasis on Gnosis, creates an elite escape hatch strikes at the heart of its appeal and raises profound ethical questions. At its core, Gnosticism posits that true salvation comes not from blind faith or good works, but from a deep experiential knowledge of the divine, Gnosis. This knowledge, however, is not readily available to all. It is often described as esoteric or hidden and requiring significant effort to attain. This very nature of Gnosis as a specialized and difficult to acquire understanding leads to the unsettling possibility that it might be an exclusive path accessible only to a select few. And this raises the specter of spiritual hierarchy, where those who possess Gnosis are elevated above those who do not, creating a divide between the enlightened and unenlightened. The idea of an elite escape hatch implies a system where spiritual liberation is a privilege, not a right. It suggests that the vast majority of humanity, through no fault of their own, may be excluded from true salvation. This raises questions about the justice and compassion of such a system. Is the material world merely a holding pen for the spiritually unfortunate, a cosmic dumping ground for those who lack the means or capacity to attain Gnosis? This suspicion challenges the very notion of a loving and universally accepted divine being and forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that Gnosticism might inadvertently create a spiritual haves and have-nots situation, mirroring the social inequalities it purports to transcend. Spiritual elitism, in the context of Gnosticism, manifests as the belief that Gnosis is not a universally accessible path. It implies a system where spiritual enlightenment is reserved for a select few, those deemed worthy or capable of attaining this profound knowledge. This exclusivity is not necessarily based on moral virtue or good deeds, but rather on the possession of esoteric understanding, often requiring intellectual prowess, dedicated study, or even a specific predisposition. It suggests a hierarchy of souls where those who have acquired Gnosis are elevated above those who remain in ignorance. This division raises critical questions about fairness and justice within the Gnostic framework. If Gnosis is the only key to escaping the demiurge's prison, what becomes of the vast majority of humanity who never encounter or attain this transformative knowledge? The Gnostic cosmology, in its strictest interpretations, suggests that these individuals remain trapped in the cycle of reincarnation, bound to the material world and its inherent suffering. This raises the unsettling possibility that countless souls throughout history are effectively excluded from salvation, their lives rendered meaningless in the grand scheme of cosmic liberation. This exclusion becomes particularly troubling when considering those born into unfavorable circumstances. Individuals born into poverty, war-torn regions, or isolated communities may lack access to education, spiritual teachings, or the resources necessary to pursue Gnosis. Are these individuals, through no fault of their own, condemned to eternal suffering? Does their place of birth or social status determine their eternal fate? This raises profound questions about justice and fairness. If Gnosis is truly the only path, does this mean that a significant portion of humanity is predestined to remain trapped simply because they are born into situations that denied them the opportunity to seek liberation? As the question echoes, what happens to those who never find Gnosis? Are they simply left behind? This question of cosmic abandonment exposes a fundamental tension within Gnosticism, challenging the notion of a loving and compassionate divine being and highlighting the potential for spiritual elitism. A critical examination of Gnosticism reveals a potential tension between the pursuit of individual liberation and the concept of universal compassion. The central focus on Gnosis as the sole means of escaping the demiurge's flawed creation can lead to a prioritization of personal salvation over the collective well-being of humanity. This emphasis on individual transcendence may inadvertently diminish the value placed on acts of compassion, empathy, and altruism within the material world. And if the material world is seen as an illusion, a prison to be escaped, then the suffering experienced within it may be viewed as ultimately inconsequential. Acts of kindness, love, and sacrifice, while perhaps commendable in a human context, are seen as bound to the illusory realm and therefore lacking in true, lasting significance. This devalues the very essence of human experience, suggesting that compassion and empathy are irrelevant in the grand scheme of cosmic liberation. The question then arises, is there any room for compassion in a system that only saves a select few? This question challenges the ethical foundation of Gnosticism, highlighting the potential for a detached and even indifferent attitude towards the suffering of others. The focus on individual Gnosis, while offering a path to personal liberation, risks neglecting the moral imperative to alleviate suffering and promote well-being within the shared human experience. The Gnostic cosmology, with its distinct separation between the transcendent monad and the flawed demiurge, raises profound questions about divine indifference to human suffering. The monad, often described as a being of pure light and perfection, is typically seen as utterly beyond the reach of the material world, its attention focused on its own internal perfection rather than the plight of trapped souls. This transcendence suggests a lack of direct involvement in human affairs, implying the monad neither intervenes in worldly events nor alleviates suffering within the demiurge's creation. Similarly, the demiurge is often depicted as ignorant and self-deceived, incapable of understanding or even addressing the suffering he inflicts. His flawed creation, driven by his own limitations, results in a world of pain, decay, and illusion. And this perception of the monad and the demiurge as indifferent to human suffering has significant implications for prayer and the search for meaning. If the monad is distant and uninvolved, and the demiurge is ignorant and incapable, then prayers offered from within the material world may be seen as futile, unanswered cries in a cosmic void. This raises the unsettling question, does the divine even care about our suffering? This question challenges the very foundation of religious faith, undermining the human desire for connection with the divine and the hope for solace in times of distress. It creates a sense of existential dread, a feeling of being abandoned in a cold and indifferent universe where suffering is ultimately meaningless. The Gnostic cosmology, with its stark depiction of the material world as a prison and the vast majority of humanity trapped within it, carries a significant psychological toll. The constant awareness of being imprisoned in a flawed creation ruled by an ignorant demiurge and seemingly abandoned by a distant monad can lead to profound feelings of despair, apathy, and fear. The belief that one's existence is essentially a meaningless cycle of suffering with only a slim chance of escape through Gnosis can create a sense of existential dread and hopelessness. The potential for despair is particularly acute when considering the vast majority of humanity who may never attain Gnosis. The realization that they are destined for eternal entrapment with no hope of true liberation can lead to a sense of profound helplessness and resignation. Apathy can also arise as a coping mechanism, as a way to detach from the suffering of the material world and avoid the pain of recognizing one's trapped state. Furthermore, the constant fear of remaining trapped, of failing to attain Gnosis, can create a state of chronic anxiety and unease. The feeling of being constantly watched by the archons can add to this sense of paranoia. So the question, how does the belief system affect the mental health of those who believe it, is not merely academic. It speaks to the very potential for psychological harm inherent in Gnostic cosmology. The belief system can create a toxic mental environment where fear, hopelessness, and isolation dominate, undermining the mental well-being and the ability to find joy and meaning in life. The ethical implications for Gnostic practitioners are complex and multifaceted, particularly considering the questions of shared knowledge and addressing suffering. The very nature of Gnosis, as a profound and often esoteric understanding, raises the dilemma of whether it should be shared with those who have not yet attained it. If Gnosis is the key to liberation, does a moral obligation exist to disseminate this knowledge to help others escape the demiurge's prison? Or is it a personal journey, a solitary test that should not be interfered with? Some might argue that sharing Gnosis is a moral imperative, a way to alleviate suffering and guide others towards liberation. And then there's others that might contend that Gnosis is a deeply personal experience and that attempting to impose it on others could be counterproductive or even harmful. They might argue that individuals must discover Gnosis for themselves at their own pace and that premature exposure could lead to misinterpretations or misuse of the teachings. The Gnostic view of the material world as an illusion raises questions about the responsibility to address suffering within it. If the material world is ultimately unreal, does it matter if people suffer? Does a Gnostic practitioner have a moral obligation to alleviate suffering, or should they focus solely on their own spiritual liberation? Some might argue that compassion and empathy are still important, even with the illusory realm, and that Gnostics have a responsibility to help others, regardless of the ultimate nature of reality. Others might contend that focusing on worldly suffering distracts from the pursuit of Gnosis, and that true liberation lies in transcending the material realm altogether. This ethical dilemma underscores the tension between individual salvation and collective responsibility within Gnosticism. These are complex questions with no easy answer. Gnosticism, like any complex belief system, presents a multifaceted worldview that can be interpreted in various ways. The arguments presented here are not intended to condemn or dismiss Gnosticism, but rather to stimulate critical thinking and ethical reflection. the tension between individual liberation and collective responsibility, the challenge of reconciling divine transcendence with human suffering, and the potential for spiritual elitism are not unique to Gnosticism. These are universal themes that resonate across various spiritual and philosophical traditions, and it is important to acknowledge the complexity of these issues and to recognize that there are no simple solutions. Ultimately, it is up to each individual to decide what they believe. The Gnostic cosmology, with its profound insights and challenging dilemmas, offers a unique perspective on the nature of reality and the human condition. Whether one finds solace or unease in these beliefs is a matter of personal interpretation. However, the questions raised by Gnosticism concerning spiritual elitism, divine indifference, and moral responsibility remain relevant regardless of one's personal beliefs. These questions encourage us to consider the ethical implications of our own belief system and to strive for a more compassionate and just understanding of the world. It pushes us to consider how our spiritual beliefs impact our actions and the responsibility we hold to others. So what do you think? Do you believe that Gnosticism inherently creates a spiritual have and have-not situation? How do you reconcile the pursuit of individual liberation with the responsibility to address suffering? Share your thoughts and engage in further discussion in the comments below. Thanks for listening.